So the respiratory system consists of structures which are involved in physically moving air into and out of the lungs and the process of gas exchange. Gas exchange will take place at the air-filled pockets called alveoli. There are 5 functions of the respiratory system. The first is to provide a large area for gas exchange between the air and circulating blood. Second is it moves air along the respiratory passageways to and from gas exchange surfaces of the lungs. Third, to protect respiratory surfaces from dehydration, temperature changes, and pathogens. Fourth, produces sounds for speaking, singing, and other forms of communication. And fifth, aids in sense of smell within the nasal cavity. The respiratory system can be divided based on anatomical structures into 2 divisions. We have the upper respiratory system, which will include the nose, nasal cavity, paranasal sinuses, and the pharynx. These structures are functioned to filter, warm, and humidify the incoming air. The lower respiratory system, which will include the larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. The lungs will contain bronchioles, which are involved in air conduction, moving air from one area to the next, and alveoli, which will include gas exchange. Here we can see the anatomical structures involved within the respiratory system. You can see the upper respiratory system here, and then we have our lower respiratory system here. So the functional zones of the respiratory tract. The respiratory tract refers to the passageways carrying air to and from exchange surfaces in the lungs. It is divided into 2 portions, the conducting portion from the nasal cavity to the larger bronchioles. This again will filter, warm, and humidify the air. We then have the respiratory portion, where the smallest and thinnest bronchioles, and this will also include the alveoli, which is a site of gas exchange. The epithelial lining, the conducting portion of the respiratory tract, is referred to as the respiratory mucosa. It's going to consist of ciliated columnar epithelium with many mucus cells. An underlying lamina propria, which is an underlying supportive connective tissue to the epithelium. Mucus coats exposed surfaces of the respiratory tract. And cilia will sweep mucus and trap debris towards the pharynx. This process called the Mucociliary Escalator, where you're moving things up from the lower respiratory tract back up to the upper respiratory tract, where you'll either cough, sneeze, and remove that debris from the respiratory tract. Debris and microorganisms swallowed and destroyed by acids and enzymes in the stomach. And here you can see the lining. Here you have mucus gland. We'll secrete that mucus. And here you can see the cilia lining these columnar cells. These are columnar cells or column-shaped cells. And particles will get trapped here, and then they'll move back up in this upward direction. So let's look at the different structures. The nose. Air enters in through the nares or the nostrils. The nostrils will open into the nasal cavity. We have a few structures that will form the nasal cavity. This includes the nasal vestibule. This is the space enclosed by the flexible tissues of the nose. The nasal septum will divide the cavity into right and left sides. You then have a hard palate, which forms the floor of the nasal cavity. It separates it from the oral cavity, and it consists of bone. The soft palate will extend behind the hard palate and lies under the nasopharynx. The nasal cavity opens into the nasopharynx at the posterior internal apertures, and the nasal concha will project from the lateral walls to help to warm and humidify incoming air by increasing the turbulence of airflow. Now, flow through the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity is cleared and flushed by mucus produced by the respiratory mucosa, mucus produced in the paranasal sinuses, tears flowing through the nasal lacrimal duct, and exposure to dust, debris, allergens, or vapors will increase mucus production. The pharynx is also called the throat. This is a chamber that's shared by the respiratory and digestive systems. It extends between the posterior and internal apertures and entrances of the larynx and the esophagus. The pharynx is divided up into three divisions: the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. The nasopharynx is from the posterior internal apertures to the posterior edge of the soft palate. It is lined by ciliated respiratory epithelium, and it contains pharyngeal tonsils and entrances to the auditory tubes. The oropharynx is from the soft palate to the base of the tongue. It is lined by stratified squamous epithelium, and it contains the palatine tonsils. And then finally, the laryngopharynx. This is from the base of the tongue at the level of the hyoid bone to the entrance of the esophagus. This is lined by stratified squamous epithelium. And here we can see the three different divisions. We have the nasopharynx right in this area here, oropharynx behind the oral cavity, and then the laryngopharynx behind the larynx. The larynx, this is a tube that surrounds and protects the glottis, or the voice box. Air leaves the pharynx and enters the larynx through a narrow opening of the glottis. The larynx is made up of 9 cartilages stabilized by ligaments and skeletal muscles. The 3 largest or single cartilages are the epiglottis, the thyroid cartilage, and the cricoid cartilage. You then have 3 pairs of smaller cartilages, which include the arytenoid, the corniculate, and the cuneiform. Looking at the large cartilages of the larynx, the epiglottis projects superior to the glottis. It covers the glottis during swallowing, and it prevents entry of liquids and food into the respiratory tract. The thyroid cartilage forms the anterior and lateral surfaces of the larynx. Ridge on the anterior surface is referred to as the Adam's apple. The cricoid cartilage, this is a ring of cartilage just inferior to the thyroid cartilage. And here we can look at the anatomy of the larynx and the various cartilages that make up that structure. The trachea, this is a tough, flexible tube. It's also called the windpipe. It runs from the cricoid cartilage to branches of the primary bronchi. The walls are supported by 15 to 20 C-shaped tracheal cartilages. Open parts of the C-shaped cartilages will face posteriorly toward the esophagus. This allows food along the esophagus to pass through. They are also connected by elastic ligaments and what they call the trachealis muscle. The muscle is actually under autonomic nervous system control, which we'll get to. Autonomic means you do not have any conscious control over that. And then sympathetic stimulation will dilate the trachea. The bronchi, the trachea branches into 2 bronchi. The right main bronchus will supply the right lung. It's larger and at a steeper angle, and it creates more likely pathway for foreign objects to travel down because it's larger. The left main bronchus will supply the left lung. And here we can see the trachea right here. The branch port is called the carina, and then we have our right and left bronchi. And by the way, this is the C-shaped rings of the trachea. This is the trachealis muscle here, and this would be the esophagus right here, which is posterior. So the bronchial tree is formed by the main bronchi and their branches. We have the lobar bronchi. These are the first branches off the main bronchi. They enter the lung lobes. There are 2 in the left lung and 3 in the right lung. So there's 2 lobes in the left lung and there's 3 lobes in the right lung. The reason for this is, remember, the heart actually lays to the left side of the body, and that actually takes up some of the space that the lung would normally take up. You then have segmental bronchi. They branch off the lobar bronchi, and you get 9 to 10 in each lung. The bronchioles, as you proceed further along the bronchial tree, the diameter will start to decrease. The percentage of cartilage also decreases. The bronchial is a lung passageway after cartilage has disappeared. The walls are dominated by smooth muscle. Sympathetic activation relaxes muscle, causing bronchodilation. Parasympathetic activation contracts muscle, causing bronchoconstriction. And here we can see the various bronchial branching that is occurring. Terminal to respiratory bronchioles. The terminal bronchioles are the smallest in diameter. They're the thinnest as well. And they are the thinnest and smallest conducting passageways. The average diameter is about 0.3 to 0.5 millimeters in diameter. Each supplies one pulmonary lobule. This is a segment of lung tissue that's bound by connective tissue partitions. They are supplied by the bronchial, pulmonary arterial, and the venule. The terminal bronchioles will branch into the respiratory bronchioles within each lobule. They may have some exchangeability, and they can lead into the alveolar ducts. And here you can see we have our terminal bronchioles here, okay? And they will essentially feed into these tufts of alveoli, which are these air sacs. And one thing I want to point out here is we're seeing this, you can see there's these little pores between each of the alveoli. This allows airflow to move between each of the alveoli. Another thing I want to point out here is each alveolus is actually surrounded by a capillary bed, and this is the site of gas exchange. So the alveolar ducts end at the alveolar sacs. These are the chambers that connect to multiple individual alveoli. Each lung contains about 150 million alveoli, which will give lungs their spongy area appearance, vastly increases surface area. The total surface area of both lungs is about 140 meters squared, which if you think about, that's actually a very large surface area. This allows for extensive rapid gas diffusion to meet the metabolic needs of the body. Looking at the structure of the alveoli, we have primary cells, which are called pneumocytes type 1 or type 1 alveolar cells. They are usually thin, simple squamous epithelium. Then we have roaming alveolar macrophages or dust cells. They patrol the epithelium, phagocytizing particles within the alveoli. And then finally, we have pneumocytes type 2 or type 2 alveolar cells. They produce surfactant. Surfactant helps to keep the alveoli open by reducing the surface tension. Lack of surfactant triggers respiratory distress syndrome. A lot of times, premature babies aren't yet quite producing surfactant, as it's one of the last things for the body to sort of get up and running. And here you can see the various structures of the alveoli. You have your type 1 cells here. These are those simple squamous. You can see the nice little pore. You can see the capillaries here in red. And then you can see the roaming macrophages, these yellow guys. So the blood-air barrier, the alveoli, this is also called the respiratory membrane. It's the site of gas exchange or diffusion. This can be as thin as 0.1 microns. Average is about 0.5 microns thick. And there are three layers that consist of this respiratory membrane. You have the alveolar cell layer, which is squamous epithelial cells lining the alveoli. You have the capillary endothelium of the adjacent capillary. And then you have fused basement membranes between the alveolar and the endothelial cells. The lungs are divided into lobes. They are separated by deep fissures. The left lung has 2 lobes, the superior and inferior lobe. The right lung has 3 lobes, superior, middle, and inferior. Around apex of each lung extends up to the base of the neck above the first rib. The concave base of the lung sits on the diaphragm. The costal cartilage or costal surface follows the inner contours of the costal cartilage or the rib cage. And the mediastinal surface of the left lung has a cardiac notch. This provides space for the pericardial cavity. And you can see that here, this little notch out right here, this is that cardiac notch. The pleural cavities, they surround each lung within the thoracic cavity. The pleura is a serous membrane of pleural cavity. You have the visceral pleura, which covers the outer surface of the lungs. and the parietal pleura, which lines the inside of the chest wall and the diaphragm. The pleural layers will secrete pleural fluid, reducing friction. The pleural cavity is potential space between the two layers. You have the parietal and the visceral layers, usually in very close contact with each other. And you can see those structures here. A pneumothorax, this is when you essentially have a puncture within the thoracic cavity. This occurs when the parietal pleura is punctured or the alveoli are damaged in an injury. Air enters the pleural cavity and fluid bond between the pleural layers is broken. The result may be lung collapse and treatment usually involves removing the air and, more importantly, sealing up that pneumothorax. Okay, so now let's talk about respiration. Respiration is gas exchange. Respiration includes two integrated processes. We have external respiration. This is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between body fluids and the external environment. This meets respiratory demands of cells under various conditions. Internal respiration is a process where we absorb oxygen and release carbon dioxide by cells. External respiration includes three steps: pulmonary ventilation or breathing. This is the physical movement of air into and out of the lungs. Gas diffusion at two sites across the respiratory membrane, which is the blood-air barrier, and across the capillary walls between the blood and the body tissues. And then you also have transport of oxygen, CO2, between the alveolar capillaries as well as capillaries to other tissues. This is going to be accomplished by the cardiovascular system. What happens if you don't get adequate oxygen concentrations? Well, you can have hypoxia. This is decline in tissue oxygen. Metabolic activities will become limited because cells are oxygen starved. Anoxia, this is supply of oxygen is cut off completely. The cells die off quickly, and damage from strokes or heart attacks are a result of anoxia. Process of pulmonary ventilation. This is moving air into and out of the lungs. This is the physical movement of air into and out of the respiratory tract. Primary function is to maintain alveolar ventilation, the movement of air into and out of the alveoli. This prevents the buildup of carbon dioxide, as well as ensuring the continuous supply of oxygen. And the way that this happens is we have pressure differences that allow for airflow into and out of the lungs. Air moves down a pressure gradient. In a closed, flexible container, such as the lungs, gas or air pressure is altered by changing the volume of the container. If you increase in volume, you decrease in pressure. They are inversely proportional to one another. If you decrease in volume, you increase in pressure. The volume of lung depends on the volume of the thoracic cavity. So how do we change the thoracic volumes? The diaphragm will form the floor of the thoracic cavity. A relaxed diaphragm is dome-shaped, projects up into the thoracic cavity, it compresses the lungs. Contraction pulls it downward, increasing the volume of the thoracic cavity and expanding the lungs. The rib cage, elevation increases volume of the thoracic cavity. You have the external intercostal muscles and accessory muscles. Relaxation decreases the volume of the thoracic cavity. You have the internal intercostals and other accessory muscles, which will accomplish that. So this is looking at rest. Here's inhalation. During inhalation, what you have happening is the diaphragm is depressed or the rib cage is elevated. The volume of the thoracic cavity increases. This decreases the pressure and airflow moves inward. The opposite will happen with exhalation. Now, gas exchange, this is a different story. This depends on two factors. One is the partial pressure gradient of gases involved, and the diffusion of molecules between a gas and a liquid. So oxygen and carbon dioxide actually have limited ability to dissolve in plasma. Tissues need more oxygen and generate more CO2 than can be dissolved. This is where red blood cells come into play. They can carry both gases on hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide can also be converted to a soluble compound, which is bicarbonate ion. As gases are removed from the plasma, more will diffuse in. So oxygen transport, about 1.5% of oxygen is transported in solution in plasma, which is not a lot at all. The remainder, 98.5%, binds to the central ion atom in each of the 4 heme units of hemoglobin. This is a reversible reaction. And what happens is, this is how it gets transported in the red blood cells, is bound to hemoglobin. Now, a little problem is that carbon monoxide can prevent oxygen from binding to hemoglobin, and it actually binds much more better than oxygen, and this can actually lead to hypoxia, which can lead to death. Carbon dioxide transport, carbon dioxide generated as a product of aerobic cell metabolism. It's a normal waste product of cellular respiration. It's transported in 3 ways. 7% by CO2, dissolved in plasma, 23% on red blood cells, bound to hemoglobin. 70% will be by that bicarbonate ion. And here you can see the transport of CO2. So maintaining oxygen CO2 levels, cells are continually absorbing oxygen and generating carbon dioxide. The rates of absorption and generation need to be balanced with delivery and removal, meaning you want to be bringing in as much oxygen as you're disposing of CO2. There are 2 homeostatic processes that help to maintain equilibrium. That is changes in blood flow and oxygen delivery under local controls. Meaning that if you need more oxygen, you can increase your heart rate, which will pump blood through faster, and you also increase your respiratory rate. So those 2 systems tend to be tied into each other. Changes in the depth and rate of respiration under control of the brain's respiratory systems. The respiratory system does work with other systems. It provides oxygen actually to all systems in the body, disposes of CO2 for all systems. The nervous system controls the rate and depth of respiration, and extensive structural and functional connections to the cardiovascular system are required for the respiratory system to function properly. And that is it for this chapter.